Connecticut's delegation on Capitol Hill continues to hold rank in important committees and lead important congressional conversations. This morning on The Real Story, we're checking in on the progress that's been made. Congressman John Larson joining us to break down a new plan to bolster Social Security benefits. But first, U.S. Representative Joe Courtney is here in studio to talk about his recent trip with world leaders and how the annual defense budget could impact Connecticut industry. Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. We're checking in with our congressman from Capitol Hill. First up here is U.S. Representative Joe Courtney, a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee and senior member of the House's Education and Workforce Committee. Last time we talked here, we were talking about the education budget. Now we're talking about defense, which really encompasses a lot of what he's been working on. Congressman Courtney, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Emma. It's great to be back.
And we know you've been traveling. You
Yes.
just got back just a few days ago from a trip to Singapore, quite a ways away, but in a region that you've really been focusing on in the Indo-Pacific. You were meeting with world leaders talking about defense. Tell me a little bit about what some of those conversations were like. What did you take away from that trip?
Sure. So this was the 21st annual Shangri-La Conference, as it's called. And again, it brings together all the Indo-Pacific countries on every sort of end of the spectrum. China actually sent a delegation, as well as the U.S. delegation, which was led by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. There were 5 members of Congress, which I was part of that CODEL, as they call it. And the keynote speaker was the president of the Philippines, who delivered a really pretty powerful message about maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is really under grave threat right now because of China's coercive behavior, really in almost every realm, maritime, in the air flight space as well. And a lot of breakout sessions to get a chance to talk to different delegations that were there. Singapore is a real crossroads in that part of the world, has been historically. And so, again, the contrast between the message that Secretary Austin brought, which is that the U.S. is really interested in trying to maintain the status quo of maritime rights, flyover rights, strong trade relationships, not having one hegemony sort of exercise control. The defense minister from China who spoke, Admiral Jun, delivered actually a much different message, which is basically saying, China really has every right to sort of dominate the region with their view of maritime claims, the 9-dash line, which was in the Barbie movie, as you may recall, that was talked about.
A real contrast there, as you said.
Very strong contrast.
Yeah, and I know you also met with President Zelensky from Ukraine. What were you talking about with him?
So he flew in really sort of unannounced, and but was meeting with a number of delegations. He asked to meet with our group, and it was like late in the evening. The guy is the Energizer Bunny. He just seems very sort of energetic and alert. And number one, was very appreciative of the supplemental package, which is going to send over a lot more military assistance, most of which, by the way, is made in America. 84% of that package is about American defense industry, providing that material. Kind of gave an update in terms of what's going on. I mean, the good news, the level of bombardment now has been cut in half, or successful bombardment, because now they do have more defense missile capability, as well as their own artillery replenishment that's taking place there. It's still a tough struggle. He was there really to particularly urge all of the groups there to tell China, don't support Putin. Tell China to join the world on June 15th, where there's going to be a summit in Switzerland to talk about ways to resolve the war in Ukraine. And then obviously just to, obviously stay in touch with different countries and allies that are there. I brought up the fact that, they have made incredible strides in terms of pushing back the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. A third of their fleet has been sunk. Given the fact that Ukraine doesn't really even have a Navy, is really quite amazing. And that's how their grain shipments have actually now been restored for helping the rest of the world with issues of food and insecurity and starvation.
Right, and you mentioned an increase in some of that artillery. As you mentioned, a lot of this has been about defense spending and sending, more elements to Ukraine amongst other places. And I want to get into the budget being crafted in a little bit, but Ukraine and Israel are these very active defense and aid funding needs, that active conflicts we see going on right now. With AUKUS, though, it's really preventative, as you said, more about allyship. How much importance is really being placed right now on ensuring that these bonds are really strong?
Yeah, I mean, in the Indo-Pacific, which, again, Secretary Austin still sort of believes is kind of the pacing sort of 21st century threat in terms of trying to rebalance the deterrence equation that's in that part of the world there. And AUKUS, which is, again, an extraordinary security agreement, which is going to be about technology sharing between the UK, US, and Australia. The sort of centerpiece of it is the nuclear submarine recapitalization or capitalization program that Australia is going through because their aging diesel subs are really running out of shelf life and service life. So, again, we just really enacted all the authorities back in December to sort of enable all of that sharing. I will tell you that in Singapore, the feedback was very strong. I call it AUKUS envy, with other countries who were saying, Korea, when can we maybe think about buying a nuclear submarine? Japan, wants to get into some of the other aspects of technology sharing, so that would change the name from AUKUS to JAUKUS, and New Zealand, other countries that are there. So, that though is not the only action in the Indo-Pacific. There's the quadrennial or quad group, which is India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S. There's another effort being made to get Japan and South Korea, who've been, historically, really ardent enemies, are now working together because they have common defense needs in terms of both North Korea and China that's there. So again, the goal and the mission is really about prevention and deterrence and not about starting a conflict. I mean, Taiwan obviously was uppermost on people's minds. And the message, again, from the Chinese defense minister was not very reassuring in terms of just them feeling that, Taiwan, the island, belongs to them and they're going to take it or control it by, any force necessary, and that's not what people want to hear.
You mentioned that AUKUS envy. We know getting that off the ground was a really big accomplishment, a lot of work going in there, but as you said, a lot of other countries want in now, but we know that it takes a lot of resources and time to actually build these subs. Just how long, and we know that work's going on right here in Connecticut. Right. So before we get into more details, just how long does it take to actually manufacture one of these?
So the contract schedule for a Virginia-class submarine is 65 months.
Wow.
Right now, because of COVID and some supply chain issues, there's been delays. And the Navy's very frustrated with those delays. Everyone is. Right. Again, we're sort of going through this tug of war right now about next year's budget because they actually said we should pause the 2 per year procurement acquisition that's been going on since 2011.
Cutting it down to 1, right?
And, my position is based on really real life feedback in the district, which is still the hub of a lot of the submarine suppliers, is that you start fluctuating the procurement, that sends a really bad signal to these companies that have to make big investment decisions. And so our committee, the House Armed Services Committee, restored that sub by a vote of 57-1 about 3 weeks ago. The appropriators are still sort of staying with the Navy's position. This is not going to get resolved probably till the end of this calendar year after the election, just that the budget process it drags on. In the meantime, there were 5,300 hires last year, 40% roughly in Rhode Island, 60% in Connecticut. They're on pace already to match that number. There was 1,800 hires for this calendar year as of last week. It's extraordinary. We had signing day down at Norwich Tech, where we had students there who were actually signing up, not just because they're graduating, but because they're actually getting hired.
Wow.
They're going to get their badge and go to work. And some of them were from other area high schools. And again, there's other initiatives in terms of job training to get that.
That workforce is so important, but like you said, they require job training, they require housing. Is this really a state and federal partnership here? You know, does Connecticut still need to be putting out incentives and programs to get this workforce here?
So Connecticut does participate in the pre-apprenticeship program, the pipeline program, as it's called. You know, it's a federal-state sort of collaboration that's there. The framework is organized under the Federal Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, WIOA, and it's really, I think, one of the highest performing workforce boards in the country, and that's been, you know, said by other folks from outside of the region here, because they've already graduated. Well, 2023 was 945 metal trades folks, you know, again, ready to get their badge and go to work. So in terms of housing and daycare, there's no question if you talk to leadership in the HR departments down there, that's a big concern for people, particularly coming in from outside the region.
Right.
So, you know, there's some encouraging examples of new housing construction in New London County. We need more. And it's a lot of this is, you know, obviously local and state driven in terms of permitting. But it is, when you're talking about this massive an increase, you know, you have to have the infrastructure to support, you know, that type of infusion of new people, which is a good problem to have.
Sure. So you mentioned, obviously, trying to get colleagues on board and wanting the funding for a second sub. We discussed that. The annual defense bill is being crafted right now, but the Republican-controlled House has moved forward with their proposal, which doesn't include that. We know you've talked recently about the struggle to work across the aisle right now. I've been talking with all of Connecticut's delegation that it really is difficult in the House to get anyone to agree on anything. You know, so with that extreme partisanship that people are seeing right now, how do you get to this compromise, and can you really get a second sub through included in this?
So again, the 57-1 vote on HASC, the House Armed Services Committee, was very encouraging, obviously, because that authorized the legal structure for a contract for that sub.
Right, but that's just a subcommittee.
It's actually a full standing committee.
Oh,
again, the Appropriations Committee is the other one where we have a problem. You know, it's early in the process. Everybody's operating under a budget cap of only 1% growth for defense. That was from the fiscal responsibility law that was passed in May to, you know, keep our full faith and credit, you know, intact. That's there. There's, I think, already a lot of feeling starting to grow, particularly in the Senate, that we're going to have to lift that cap. There's just too much going on in the world right now to really expect that. You know, another initiative that's in there is really to deal with quality of life issues, particularly for more junior enlisted folks. The Navy missed its recruiting targets last year by 7,000. Army, double.
Wow.
Air Force was below. And again, if you look at the pay grade, the pay levels for, you know, an E2, E3 enlisted person, which is, you know, where the people are coming in the door.
Right.
If you have kids, you're on food stamps. I mean, it's just, and the housing allowance is not enough in terms of, it only covers a portion if you're not on, you know, base housing that's there. So part of the Armed Services Committee bill, which included that second sub, actually is basically to rebase the salary level for those junior enlisted officers.
Increasing that,
exactly, and give them the housing allowance in full, because it's very competitive out there right now in the job market, even though it's slowing down a little bit. And you know, we really we need good people to enlist.
Yeah, well, in the beginning of the process, but like you said, sounds like you're encouraged. Could take a while, but definitely a lot going on. We'll continue to follow that. Congressman Courtney, thank you as always for joining us.
Good to see you, Emma. Thank you.
Well, there's still more to get to here, though, on The Real Story. U.S. Representative John Larson is zooming in to update us on what he says are needed adjustments to the Social Security program. We're breaking down what this all could mean for you and getting insight right from Capitol Hill.